Always the trendsetter, Carter.
Should we go ahead and dive in, Lori?
I think so.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Happy Friday. I want to welcome everyone to this important and timely conversation about housing and climate change. My name is Eric Wilson. I'm the Deputy Director of Land Use and Buildings with the New York City Mayor's Office of Climate Resiliency. I want to recognize that we had over 150 enrollees in this call from all around the world. We're super thrilled that you joined us. We were just having a presentation chat and learning about the perspectives of some of the folks that are joining us today. Really interesting backgrounds, really interesting perspectives, and we hope we touch on some issues that are meaningful for you as we all have a role in this really important conversation. The impact of climate change on our housing stock is clearly a substantial topic that's going to be much more than an hour we can spend on. For today's conversation, we're going to focus on resilient transformations in multifamily housing, with a particular focus on public housing in New York City and in other parts of New York State. I'm honored to open this conversation with two leaders in the field whose work I respect tremendously. But I want to point out that New York City is blessed with a community of housing practitioners who are already moving the needle on resilient design, from designers, builders, contractors, advocates, and of course the residents themselves. Together, we'll forge a path to ensure that every New York City resident lives in a home that will withstand the climate hazards that are already impacting our city. So to begin our conversation, I'm going to provide some context behind our office. Lori and Joy will also share remarks, followed by a brief discussion. So please feel free to add some messages into the chat, ask some questions, and we'll do our best to embark on a lively discussion. So I'm getting some feedback. If somebody could mute, make sure you're muted.
Okay, and you want to start with climate change?
So the theme for today is that New York City's housing stock must transform. We need to build in a way that anticipates future risks, but we have a lot of housing that already exists, and we need to undertake an ambitious retrofit program to get it all ready for climate change. Paramount consideration is resident health and well-being, our first consideration as we enter this conversation. So a little bit about my office. New York City's government on climate issues is arranged in two different buckets. There's the Office of Climate and Sustainability, which focuses on carbon mitigation issues, driving down our carbon, reducing our energy consumption, and embarking on building sustainability initiatives. We work with them a lot. Our shop at the Mayor's Office of Climate Resiliency is focused on climate adaptation issues. What are the ways that the city needs to change because of the climate impacts that are already set in place? So our shop at the Office of Climate Resiliency, or MOCR, so there's my team, which focuses on land use and buildings. We were talking a little bit before about social resiliency and acknowledging that adaptation is certainly not about capital investments alone. It's about relationships, and there's an extraordinarily important human side to climate adaptation. We have a waterfront team that is focused on coastal protections, which is a new asset class for New York City, many of which emerged after Hurricane Sandy. We have an infrastructure and energy team. And then finally, last but certainly not least, is our climate science and risk communications team. This group maintains our relationship with the New York City Panel on Climate Change, which is an extraordinarily important resource for us that does downscaled climate projections for New York City to help us understand more what's on the horizon. So New York City certainly is experiencing climate hazards. This summer has been very instructive, but the data that comes to us from the New York City Panel on Climate Change forecasts 3 times more likely 100-year floods by 2050, with more intense, more frequent and destructive hurricanes. Sea level rise up to 30 inches by the 2050s. This has consequences for increased tidal flooding, increased height of our groundwater table, extreme precipitation, which we're experiencing, of course, which is bringing floods to inland areas. And then, of course, temperature extremes, both extreme heat as well as extreme cold, all forecast for us. So New York City, of course, is a highly exposed city. We have 520 miles of coastline, more than Miami, Boston, San Francisco, and Los Angeles combined. But our flooding risks aren't limited to the coasts, as Hurricane Ida demonstrated to us, which delivered a 100 to 200-year storm really across the entirety of the city in one fell swoop. Record amount of rainfall that really exacerbated and illustrated our inland flooding risks. So we are a city of 8.8 million residents, as demonstrated by the 2020 census. We're forecast to grow to 9.2 million by 2050. So there's going to be a lot of pressure on our housing stock, even with these climate risks. And so I think this fact underscores the urgency behind this conversation that we're about to have. Our housing stock is really complex. So we have over 1 million buildings in New York City. The most common building type is 1 to 4 family homes, but most New Yorkers live in multifamily buildings with 5 or more family in size. So we need to be identifying solutions, strategies, opportunities across a really diverse array of building typologies as we begin this conversation. So I mentioned that we must transform our buildings over the next 30 years. There's an imperative and already a legal framework for buildings to begin a path towards less energy consumption, towards mitigating their carbon emissions with our Climate Mobilization Act. But what we're talking about today is really a focus on how do we get buildings to become resilient to climate change? How do we integrate risk mitigation and protection measures for residents? And this is this emerging field of resilient design that's going to be the theme of today's conversation. And I want to make a pitch for my agency's climate resiliency design guidelines. In case you haven't come across these, they're available on the city's website. And this is really our effort to take data, climate data that is forecast by the New York City Panel on Climate Change, and make it into actionable guidelines for designers, planners, as they're thinking about infrastructure projects, but also buildings. Our climate resiliency design guidelines not only address our flooding risks with tidal inundation and coastal storms, but they also address extreme heat. And the idea is that our existing building code, our existing approach to design is really based on historic climate data, looking in the past. The climate resiliency design guidelines add another layer of forward-looking data as forecast by the NPCC. And the idea is that our shop works with a variety of different agencies across the city to develop capacity to create infrastructure, both new infrastructure, new buildings, as well as retrofits that anticipates these risks. And so just this year, our city council requires that we investigate the climate resiliency design guidelines across the entirety of the city's capital portfolio through local law 41 that was adopted earlier in March. And what this is a pilot program. So we're going to be launching a pilot where we're working with all city agencies that have capital projects, as well as affordable housing agencies, to identify a few projects to look at, both new construction as well as retrofits. And the idea is that we're starting to apply some of this future-facing climate data and see how it influences the design of these structures. The idea is for the city to lead. Ultimately, all city capital projects will be required to use the resilient design guidelines starting in 2027, after this 5-year pilot and a revision of the climate resiliency design guidelines. So I'm happy to talk more about these in the Q&A. But really right now, I want to introduce the stars of the show. So let me start off by introducing my colleague, Lori Schulman, who's the National Director of Resilience at Enterprise Community Partners and co-facilitator with Resilience 21. Lori is a deeply committed climate risk reduction leader with 20 years experience in the fields of climate risk reduction and housing. Lori leads Enterprise Community Partners' efforts to protect and preserve affordable housing. But most consequential for us in New York City, Lori was the driving force behind the Ready to Respond guide with strategies for multifamily flood resilience strategies that emerged after Hurricane Sandy, but continues to be a vital resource for us in New York City and beyond. So and let me go ahead and introduce Joy to my colleague, Joy Cinderbrand for the New York City Housing Authority, where she serves as Vice President of Recovery and Resilience. Joy has spent her career tackling the major infrastructure projects that shape New York City while managing NYCHA's disaster recovery programs over the past 5 years. Joy has implemented the largest single grant in FEMA history and the largest federal investment in public housing since its inception. Over $2 billion of the $3 billion grant has been invested to date, and you'll hear a lot more during her presentation. So I'm honored to introduce Lori.
Thank you, Eric. And I have to tell everyone on the call, many friends are with us and good colleagues. I am such a big fan of Eric and Joy. I have worked with Eric while he was at in three different settings when he was at HPD, managing an incredible portfolio of work, as well as when he was working closely with Resilient Cities Network around the country and deeply in Puerto Rico, where he just did incredible work leading efforts to create resiliency in Puerto Rico. And then Joy, of course, I'm just such a big fan of what Joy has led, what she's created. To me, this is the A-team. You guys are, we're really happy to be together on this and to tell you all about what we're doing to ensure that affordable housing across New York City is safe. And what we're doing here, we hope will help inform you in your respective communities as you and countries as you think about how to deal with climate risk. So with further ado, I'm just going to quickly share my screen and I'm going to need everyone to just say, can you see this?
We got it, Lori.
Okay, thank you so much. And I just want to pay a special thanks to our friends at Resiliency 21. One of the co-sponsors of this event today, along with Enterprise and Resiliency 21, is a network of practitioners across the nation working to advise the administration on a variety of policies related to climate risk. So let's dive in. So this journey around figuring out what multifamily housing looks like from a perspective of trying to understand how to deal with climate change goes back a long time. I think in New York City, we really started thinking about this deeply after Superstorm Sandy, where we got incredible impacts from that tropical superstorm, lost our grid, electricity, we lost housing units, we lost buildings, we lost infrastructure. But what we gained was an awareness that climate risk is a challenge and a shock that we need to, as a city, tackle. That it is probably one of the greatest material threats of our generation, not only to New York City, but to the nation, to the world, as a matter of fact. And this is why New York City Climate Week is so critical. And we learned that we had to roll up our sleeves and get started on doing some work. So I just want to share with you what's happening right now. I'm in my role as the National Director at Enterprise's resiliency work around the country. Climate risk is showing up in a really big way for the multifamily housing industry nationally. It is creating lots of investor concern, nervous that investments and assets are going to be impacted substantially by climate risk. And this is also causing concern to the various financial regulators that are looking closely at how we're going to be able to stave off this material shock. It's also showing up in rising insurance rates. It's anticipated that that values of insurance for commercial insurance, which also includes housing, is going to be escalating by 25% by 2040. This is a big problem for certainly the affordable housing industry because we can't raise our rents, right? So we need to figure out how we're going to pay for that. Cost escalation of materials and labor is putting a burden on how we develop and the cost of development, which is going to be disrupting the development of affordable housing. Displacement of households is always a concern, impact to the economy, lowered property values. It's estimated by CoreLogic that $183 million of value has been reduced over the last year alone due to climate change in the Northeast. And it's leading to some regulatory changes. And I will also add that when we talk about multifamily housing, we need to also think about what is going on for us that we're going to be needing to pay attention to that we haven't even thought about. I think that Hurricane Ida, and many of you on the call today can attest that this was a storm that we really weren't prepared for. A lot of the buildings that got hit were not in the marked and mapped floodplain from FEMA, which means that a lot of our owners did not have insurance for flood, which means there's been a lot of damage that is not insured for. We also lost many lives that perished underneath the base fill elevation. And this precipitation event was a lingering event and more to come. And so now we have to figure out how we're going to be dealing with these kind of events. So this is a critical concern. Also to note, many folks are sheltering in place in their units because of COVID. So one note to share with you, the CDC took a leading role in ensuring that we had evacuation moratoriums on housing over the last year. Why? Because shelter is a health benefit, and especially during a pandemic, folks are sheltering in place because of their health. So housing is not just an antidote to a good life. It's not just a equity that can be transferred over generations. It is something that we need in place for good health. And as Eric touched on, the rising frequency of natural disasters is occurring with great rapidity. And the combined impact of multiple disasters occurring at once is escalating. This is a big issue that we need to deal with. And many people live in multifamily housing. So what happened? Superstorm Sandy woke us up. This was an event that happened on 2012, and it was a real wake-up call for New York and the United States for sure. 3 boroughs went dark, thousands were displaced from their homes. It was a turning point in a city that had just turned after the collapse, the destruction of the World Trade Center in 9/11. So this was a big moment for us, and we took this very seriously. We got $50 billion allocated from Congress to support New York's recovery. Many of the projects you hear about today were funded with that funding. So an enterprise immediately got to work, and we started thinking about how to support our owners in the floodplain that were impacted by the storm. We worked with 14 of the leading affordable housing owners across New York and New Jersey, many of whom are on the call today, to try to figure out what happened to the buildings, what happened to the multifamily buildings, and how can we repair these buildings. So we created what we called at that time a resiliency physical needs assessment. We had never done anything like this before. We put the best minds together at Enterprise and across New York City, and we created an assessment platform to walk through buildings. Essentially, the platform looked at low to high cost improvements that could be made. We looked at the basement. We looked at the site, the roof, and the units of the buildings. We assessed the past, present scenarios in the building. We looked at engaging building operations staff. We looked at the reserve and the retrofit schedule of the buildings to understand what exactly is happening in those buildings. 210 buildings later, we were in 210 buildings over the course of 3 months, all across the region. Thankfully, I had a car at the time. And we figured out a couple problems. One is elevation is not feasible for these multifamily buildings. We figured out that the funding reserve and the rental income is just insufficient to pay for it's something like raising a building. We also realized that residents need to stay in place. They have nowhere to go, right? Especially Section 8 place-based vouchers. And there's just nowhere for them to go. And Joy will speak to this because this is the case for so many folks in public housing. We realized that there's a need for a central community hub. And we also realized there's a deep intersection with the infrastructure. And we've realized this time and time again. Ida really brought this home when we saw so much massive flooding occur. So these are the things we learned, and we figured out what we were being told, which was, elevate those buildings, get them out of the flood elevation, was not going to work. So we quickly pulled together a brain trust of about 60 experts across the region to figure out what are the strategies to help support this housing. And we came up with Strategies for Multifamily Housing Resiliency, which is a book that's available and used today to outline some partial mitigation strategies to help improve buildings from risk. And I'm going to quickly go through them because I think this is a good framing for Joy's presentation. The first section is on protection. What are the protection strategies? These are strategies to reduce a building's vulnerability to extreme weather. We talk about wet flood proofing, dry flood proofing, perimeter flood proofing, resilient elevators, backwater valves, and sump pumps. In the next section, we talk about what are adaptation strategies to help improve the facility's ability to adapt to the changing climate. These are envelope efficiency, elevating the equipment outside of the base flood elevation, elevating living space. This is an issue we should talk about during discussion as how it shows up for our affordable housing. But we also looked at stormwater management, window shading, distributed heating and cooling, which pairs well with conversations happening around electrification today. We looked at community strategies, right? Strategies that would build community ties, creating community resiliency spaces, and developing an emergency plan, as well as organizing for community resiliency. And the last set of strategies are the strategies that help back up the building when the power is lost or there's no water. So we're looking at backup power, lighting, and potable water. And all of these strategies together are intended to help owners, operators, and regulators and funders figure out how to support buildings' resilience without just elevating it. And we have some basic terms in this book that are important for you to know. We really try to spell this out so that it's clear for all of us working in this space what we mean by DFE or BFE. So I just want to share with you all how this book has been used. It's been used all over the country, but one of the projects I want to share with you today, which I'm really proud of, and we've got some folks on the call today from the New York State Governor's Office of Storm Recovery. We went in for an award with GOSER back in 2015 to get some funding to actually show what we meant by resiliency and to sort of bring to life and activate some of those strategies. We got $38.5 million from HUD for CDBGDR funding to basically pilot some of these resiliency strategies in public housing across the state. And I'm so proud to say, thanks to the incredible work of the GOSER team, of the state, of HUD, we've got some great examples to show. And so I want to show you a couple great examples of what's been built to give you an example of how we activate resiliency. Freeport, New York, Freeport Public Housing Authority, 300 units of housing that was flooded during Sandy in the Moxby-Rigby development is now transformed. We have a new public housing facility in Freeport that is home to close to 300 residents that were moved out of the old public housing facility. And they've got a state-of-the-art housing facility with elevation, backup power, backup water. The surfaces are lighter. We've got permeable pavement. It is an efficient building, and it's a building that really replicates and represents all of what we talk about when we say resilient multifamily building. Binghamton Housing Authority has some real a new resilient roof, dry and wet flood proofing components. We have elevated the mechanicals, electrical and plumbing systems. There's a construction of a new maintenance garage and rain garden at the Binghamton Housing Authority site. And the residents now can enjoy the confidence that their homes are going to be online and functioning if there's an event. Long Beach Housing Authority. This is a facility for many seniors and many families. And I'm now happy to say that they've got new roofing, a new flood barrier along the apartment building perimeter, new exterior siding, new doors, installation of AC, efficient toilets and shower heads, and they will be more resilient if there's another storm. Town of Hempstead is going to be getting a new community resiliency hub, hopefully next year, where there's going to be programming and all kinds of supports for the community that is going to need support if there's another event. And this is mostly a senior community, so this is a really exciting project. And then the last project I wanted to tell you about is the town of Hempstead now has a new site drainage improvements, flood proofing on the apartments, landscaping improvements, and they have a new bulkhead to protect the community center and the housing facility from stormwater surge. And so this is a really important aspect to help this housing authority be stable. So I'm going to just close with a couple pieces of guidance before we move to Joy. Resiliency is a smart investment. Resilience should be part of the capital planning and ongoing operations. Never hesitate to incorporate climate risk reduction in everything that a housing owner does. Connected communities are more resilient communities. We should always build to future risk and adapt to future conditions. Current flood maps only when we have the final pieces. We need to build more affordable housing. That is what is going to get us to be more resilient. It is with great honor and with no further ado, I'd like to now bring up Joy Cinderben from NYCHA.
Thank you, Lori. I'm sorry, that was, folks, that was my errant mouse that stopped and started the recording in the middle of Lori's conclusion. So I'm sorry about that. I'm really excited to be here. I want to thank Lori and Eric for putting this together and for framing the conversation so well. So hopefully I can get through my presentation a little more quickly since you have a lot of the context. I'm at the New York City Housing Authority in New York City, and I want to start off by just giving a very brief overview of the organization. It's the largest landlord in North America. NYCHA houses about 1 in 15 New Yorkers in either public or affordable housing. And there is no secret that there's a lot of need. So there is a significant capital need. Right now, estimated about $40 billion across the portfolio. Many of the developments were constructed in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and have a significant state of good repair need to them. And it's on top of that we're talking about the impacts of climate change. So today, you're going to get a sneak peek at NYCHA's first climate adaptation plan. We're hoping to release it in the next few weeks, so you'll see the full report soon. And this is thinking about climate change, all the climate risks as they might impact our portfolio and our residents going forward. So I talked briefly about the capital need that NYCHA has. There are a number of strategies the agency is using to try to get the portfolio up to that state of good repair. And we want to embed resilience into each of those strategies. This is Bayview Houses. It went through the rental assistance demonstration program, and the developer gave it a top to bottom renovation. NYCHA will be doing this for a tranche of its portfolio, and that is an opportunity for us to embed design resilience requirements into the RFPs. We're working closely with the real estate department to make sure that all the information we know about the risks in a particular development get embedded into the requirements for the developer partners at those developments. Secondly, we are working on a holistic approach to renovation at existing developments under NYCHA management. This is moving away from the component-based replacement and thinking about kind of a top-to-bottom renovation, what that might look like. NYCHA participated in a charrette with the ACEC recently to put together the white paper guiding this process, and climate adaptation and sustainability are really at the forefront of the thinking behind the other components. And finally, the agency is still going to have some component-based replacement. This is non-discretionary funding that's given to the agency for a specific project, like a roof replacement or a boiler replacement or an elevator replacement. And so we're thinking even about those projects in the resilient and sustainable manner to get us toward our goals of being fully resilient and sustainable. NYCHA's urban forest is a huge asset. It is about 1,000 acres of tree canopy in New York City. That's second only to the Parks Department in our green space and tree coverage. It's not just an amenity and a resource to the residents, but also to that surrounding neighborhood. A lot of NYCHA developments are clustered in high heat neighborhoods, and we are really cognizant of how important it is to maintain those trees. Last year, we did a study with the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene to try to capture the value, one of the values of those trees, which is reducing heat. And it just showed that the campuses were significantly cooler than their surrounding neighborhoods. So what does that mean? It means at the same time as the agency is prioritizing state of good repair across the portfolio for critical services, we are also thinking about how we can leverage the resources we have, the caretakers and those who are passionate about the trees on their campus to maintain these trees. Like the buildings themselves, some of these trees are from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and they do require care. We want to increase the subject matter expertise access that on-the-ground staff have so that they can do strategic pruning or maintenance to preserve trees. We certainly want to add to the tree portfolio where possible. We're doing that where we're doing major capital disruptions. And then on an ongoing basis, we really need to understand this asset even further. We've been working with Nature Conservancy and Green City Force to develop a NYCHA resident-led program that is inventorying the trees. This is literally going tree by tree, campus by campus to tell us what we have, how many trees, what types of trees, what the health of the trees, the height of the trees. And this is going to help us as we do portfolio maintenance planning going forward. If we see a lack of biodiversity at a particular campus, we're going to want to increase it in future plantings. If we see older trees that are reaching the end of their lives, we'll want to make sure understory trees are planted at that campus. And by the end of this year, we'll have about 25% of the campuses inventoried. With hotter summers that Eric talked about, in-apartment cooling is really a critical necessity in New York City, especially for vulnerable residents. NYCHA is participating in a series of pilots, both for in-window and air conditioners and air source heat pumps. And this was particularly important last summer. NYCHA partnered with the city to install 16,000 air conditioners in apartments of vulnerable residents who didn't have an air conditioning unit. And especially since cooling centers were closed last summer, Lori alluded to this, sort of the inability to gather for resilience, but the need to shelter in place. And the surveys from the Department of Health showed that it had a huge impact on people's well-being and health because they were able to stay cool at home. Eric gave a lot of background on Ida. I will just add to that for the NYCHA portfolio, the storm did come very quick and not only in areas where flooding was expected, but we saw flooding in areas where it hadn't been expected. And so that really reshapes our thinking about how many developments are vulnerable. And there certainly are a considerable amount vulnerable to rainwater. It's partially because there's increased rain and also because the infrastructure at these sites was built at a time where this level of rainwater just was not even fathomable. So the idea of repairing stormwater systems is a big one. This is a $1.7 billion cost across the portfolio to think about not just what DEP is doing in the streets with the water mains, but really on the campuses, the buildings and the grounds drainage. Those distribution systems need considerable work. We're also thinking about pilots to add additional permeable surfaces to parking lots, basketball courts, and playground areas. Lots of partnership work with DEP. They've invested about $13 million so far, and we have another 35 developments in construction and design in the pipeline. This is really for their combined sewer overflow efforts, but we're also doing cloudburst pilots in South Jamaica and East Harlem to think about storms kind of beyond the typical storm, working with them to think if we can actually do some of that expansion in-house as well. On the left is a design that we were considering what the cost would be to really enhance, so that instead of just doing a playground project, could we integrate stormwater management into that project, and what would that incremental cost be? And this is sort of similar to what Eric was talking about with the pilot program for the Resilient Design Guidelines, and NYCHA is participating in that pilot. The program you've probably heard the most about is the Sandy Recovery Resilience Program. And this, NYCHA has been going full bore since it got access to the funding in December of 2015 across the city, across developments. We have over 200 buildings in the program and a very wide diversity of strategies and menu of strategies that we've deployed. Every major contract's awarded. So we have a lot of work that's in the ground. And that means that we have a lot of lessons learned. So you can visit some of our projects in person. We certainly have pictures. We'll also have a lessons learned section in the climate adaptation plan, because it's pretty critical, even as we complete the city recovery program, but as we start thinking about future developments, and certainly we want to share with everybody. First, critical infrastructure was protected as much as possible, even beyond design flood elevation, really accounting for sea level rise, and whenever possible with passive systems. We had a conversation before this event started with people who came early, and that's a really critical conversation to have in your organization about the operationalization costs, and whether there's a value in investing more on the capital side to avoid some of the maintenance and deployment costs. And finally, really recognizing how disruptive some of these investments are to do the impermeable surfaces. We had 15-foot sheet piles. We're building annex buildings. We're installing distribution systems. And so this really ought to be part of those bigger projects I was talking about, the comprehensive modernization or the full renovation projects. So to talk about passive, and I could spend a whole hour talking about the operationalization of these assets for NYCHA, but really recognizing that it's these passive protections that are better suited to that multi-risk, multi-hazard approach. At the developments where we had passive protections, there were protections from stormwater. Some of it was by design, and others we had not anticipated having to be protected from the groundwater impacts and the rainwater impacts. At some of the larger campuses, we were able to design landscape-based approaches. These are very expensive, and they are really difficult to install, and they are hugely disruptive to the communities as we're installing them. As Lori mentioned, all of the buildings are fully occupied, have been since Sandy. So we are doing construction outside people's windows, outside their doors. And so the hope is that not just the flood protection, but the placemaking will will really be an amenity for residents after we're done. That said, there were plenty of places where site constraints or budgets did not allow for passive protection. We'll have about 10,000 elements to deploy across 3 boroughs if there's another major storm where storm surge is predicted. And these are sometimes small, but other times they are large and hard to deploy, hard to store, difficult to maintain in the existing buildings, which were of course not designed for these particular elements to be inside. And so we have a lot of challenges in working across the agency in terms of training, instituting practice deployments, instituting maintenance policies and asset management policies. And this is something I could talk about forever. If there's anybody on the call who's interested in this, I'm happy to talk at a future event. Finally, backup power, both presenters before me mentioned it. This certainly is critical in post-flooding, but it's also a critical asset to the community surrounding the NYCHA developments in just sort of a typical peak summer load now. So these backup generators will allow over 200 buildings to be taken off the grid if there's a peak load, and hopefully preserve service for the communities around them. And we have 61 of the generators turned over so far. We're working our way toward the full program. So why does all this matter? Not just for you, but for us. And that's because the Sandy program was huge, but it did not cover everything in the floodplain, and it didn't cover everything in the future floodplain. And so we are already looking at other developments that are at risk that need investment so that we can start forward thinking how to incorporate that. And that's not all. We are worried about groundwater. We are already moving boiler plants out of basements because of groundwater inundation, and we expect that to worsen over time. Extreme wind is an issue. We have incorporated into the NYCHA specifications. Every roof replacement also removes any unnecessary rooftop apertures and equipment. For example, those are incinerator stacks that that no longer need to be there. They'd be removed, and then cold snaps. I just want to finish on social resilience because that did come up in both presentations as well. It's the ability for community to bounce back from an extreme event. And I will say both anecdotally and through formal studies that have been done, this is another real asset that NYCHA has. Our residents, they organize, they take care of each other, even more so than the communities immediately adjacent to them. And capital can support this social resilience and enhance it. So we are talking about the development of resilience hubs. These are really the backup power that allows for cooling, for improved resource distribution, social cohesion, and then refrigeration of medications. That's the kind of space that we think would be a real asset to residents. We do have a number of community centers, and so we are setting a goal of having one community center in each NYCHA neighborhood. There's about 30 of those clusters of developments that has this retrofit so that we can serve the residents better in times of emergency. And I shouldn't skip the construction piece and the really the critical nature of residents both before, during, and after construction, certainly through the design period. And I recognize that a lot of disaster recovery work is really non-discretionary funding, but there is always valuable input to gather during design. Construction is intrusive, and you need a considerable amount of support, not just to keep the residents abreast of progress, but literally to get the projects done. We have to do rooftop generator lifts. We've done over 200. That requires the top 2 floors of those buildings to be evacuated. If you have a resident who won't leave, you cannot do the lift. We have to do utility outages to turn on new equipment. All of this really requires the cooperation and the support of the residents that we're impacting. And finally, post-construction, we're really trying to be thoughtful about how do we communicate to people who weren't here during our construction meetings, tenants who arrive after, or caretakers who arrive after. A lot of the floodproofing and sustainability efforts are invisible effectively. And so if we don't effectively communicate to people why elements have to be maintained or why to avoid digging in a certain area, then we might undermine the systems that we've installed. So part of that is communicating what we're installing and why. And I grew up near Sheepshead Bay, like probably a mile from the marsh, and this was just not an issue. New Yorkers didn't, this is new to all New Yorkers. This is new to the residents. This is new to the staff. And so we've been working on the types of graphics that allow us to really communicate why we're doing what we're doing, so that people can both appreciate the rationale behind that intrusion and that disruption, but also help us maintain these systems and value them, avoid accidental breakage or vandalism. And I want to make sure I did talk quickly because I wanted to make sure we had time for questions. I'm really excited to talk more about the program and also the upcoming climate adaptation plan.
Thank you, Joy, and thank you, Lori. I learn something from each of you every time we get together, and I'm so looking forward to the NYCHA vulnerability assessment. I think it will be an extraordinarily useful precedent for us all, especially coming from the nation's largest landlord. So I do see a few questions coming in from the chat. I just wanted to kick off with a general question to each of you, and feel free to keep the chat coming. I'm going to ask folks who are putting questions into the chat just if they could unmute themselves, so I'll call on you when we're ready so you can ask your question. But just to kick things off, I wanted to ask, so we covered a lot of examples from public housing. And these, of course, are homes for our most vulnerable residents. What special considerations do we need to take into account as we're embarking on climate retrofits in these kinds of buildings with these kinds of residents, especially if the residents are still in place?
Well, I can say for NYCHA, there's really been a lot of community outreach, considerably more than there had been for component-based projects that preceded this. And a lot of that engagement is at the residents' discretion through the email, the phone, the website. But practically speaking, preparing people for the level of disruption is really critical. And I say this because not just residents, but other stakeholders in neighborhood, advocates and elected officials who had seen all the information about the investments that were going to be made, were still shocked about how disruptive it is. And so this is, it is a negative externality. There are lots of things you can do to mitigate it, but it is going to be a really disruptive period. So that's something that people should be very aware of.
And I think, just to build on what Joy said, communicating the value of what you're doing and the value proposition is important, because it's critical that residents know what's happening in their homes, and that NYCHA is working to protect and preserve their critical housing in a city where there's just no affordable housing. So I think, I just want to, again, special thanks to Joy for handling all of that important work, because residents can't move. There's nowhere to move to.
Absolutely. Abigail had a couple of questions. Abigail, would you go ahead and unmute yourself and ask?
Yep. Thank you all for hosting this session. My name is Abigail. I am a program manager at the National League of Cities, and a lot of our members are these small, medium towns and communities. And so in thinking about these resources that you both referenced, I was wondering if it offers context to how these small towns and cities that are under 30,000 residents or under 100,000 residents can be approaching these challenges? Because from speaking with them, a lot of times it might just be one staff member they have in the whole department or in the local government who's working on sustainability, or one equity staff person. And so these, even the small projects you mentioned, could be really challenging for them to address on a funding and staff capacity perspective.
Yeah, it's such a good question. I can offer my thoughts, and then Laurie and Joy, please do dive in. You know, Abigail, I think, so we, you know, certainly in our office, our first orientation is to New York City and to the agencies that we work with. And much of the guidance that has come out of our shop to date is very focused on our specific climate threats, which of course vary significantly as you go across the country, and just consider context specific climate hazards and risks and sort of the built environment of those communities. So I would suggest that you know, to use our precedent with caution, because it's really intended for our context. That said, New York City contains so many different kinds of buildings, and there's a little bit of everything inside, you know, from Staten Island to Midtown Manhattan. You know, there's just a lot of different, you know, certainly if you're looking at building typologies, but, you know, I would also make the argument with infrastructure. So, you know, I think there could be lessons learned. So I think the answer to your question is nuanced, and we should probably keep that conversation going, especially as we start thinking about how to deploy some of these solutions at scale.
All right, thank you. And if anyone on the call, or if the three of you have recommendations of even like partners that, you know, work at that smaller scale, I would love to have the contact information. So thank you.
Abigail, I would just offer, you know, we at Enterprise, we work with a lot of rural communities, tribes, and areas of the country that may not have the resources that New York has. And I would offer that one of the things that networks can do is help sister some of the capacity needs from communities to help provide guidance. A lot of smaller communities do not have, you know, the internal capacity or staffing to run these kind of projects, but they desperately need help. So one of the things we can do as a community is to offer that help, to make sure that, you know, we can relay funding opportunities that come forward for climate risk reduction, make sure that we can share best practices in resiliency that communities can take and use and implement.
Thank you.
Alana, I think I saw a question from you in the queue. Great to hear from you.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to unmute myself. I hope you can hear me. Great presentations, everyone. And great to see all the terrific work that you're doing, Joy, at NYCHA. I had a specific question, I guess, for Joy, but maybe it sort of goes to all of you, which relates to navigating the funding sources for these projects. I know it can be quite complex. I also know that sometimes there can be challenges